topic.
Okay, let's do it. What's the update now? What is the latest breakingest status of these lawsuits that are going to come to a head within the next 2.5 weeks?
So because so many of the key reforms were not passed by legislatures outside of Nevada, and because Justice Kavanaugh wrote that decision in the South Carolina case that we discussed last week, where he said that judicially engrafted election rules are likely to be struck down. They have to be passed by the legislative branch if we're going to recognize and respect them. Then there's been a litany of good decisions. So in Arizona, courts had extended the registration deadline because Democrats got whipped a lot in voter registration. At least that's one hypothesis of why the judge did what he did. Plus, most critically, a federal judge had issued an opinion that said you could sign your ballot 5 days after Election Day. In other words, so that just encouraged a bunch of unsigned ballots to go in and then to find the voter who forgot to sign the ballot and come in 5 days after Election Day to pad the ballot box. Both of those rules struck down by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So now you have to get your ballot in by Election Day in Arizona, and voter registration's already over and finished. In Wisconsin, they had, again, another court had extended the deadline for submission of ballots. A Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, based on Justice Kavanaugh's decision, invalidated that and said, no, all ballots have to be reported by Election Day. In Michigan,
these are all state. I mean, obviously, these are all state decisions. And now I'm remembering what you said before, because all of the election is run on a state-by-state basis. So what precedent does one of these state decisions set for another state? Anything or nothing?
The big one really was Kavanaugh. Once Kavanaugh said, if the source of the election rule is a judicially engrafted source, then that election rule is likely to be struck down as unconstitutional. If, on the other hand, it's a legislatively sourced, then it's likely to be upheld regardless of what it means. And so because so many of these rules were judicially engrafted, in Wisconsin, it was a judge who did it. So now you have to get your ballots in by Election Day in Wisconsin. In Michigan, it was the State Court of Appeals following the Michigan Supreme Court, which had twice reminded the dear governor, Governor Whitmore of Pennsylvania, of Michigan, that no, she can't just continue to issue edicts like she's a royal queen. Well, the Court of Appeals said the same thing about the election ballots. They have to be now in by Election Day. Then in Minnesota, same rules. It has to be in by Election Day. Iowa has to be in by Election Day. So that leaves two main cases or states up for grabs. South Carolina, the witnessing requirement is still there. In Virginia, witnessing requirement was relaxed but still present. And that's the Pennsylvania decision pending before the U.S. Supreme Court and the Nevada decision up at the Ninth Circuit. Based on what Judge Kavanaugh ruled, the Nevada's crazy rules are going to happen, because that was actually passed, though in a rushed form, by the state legislature and signed by the governor, because you have Democratic control top to bottom. So in Nevada, your ballots can be 14 days later. Everybody's getting ballots. It's supposed to be only active registered voters. I'm getting multiple ballots at my location in Las Vegas by someone that clearly hasn't lived here in over 5 years. So I guess that's 6 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, somebody was an active ballot. People are reporting as many as 18 to 20 ballots being received at their home. So Nevada is going to be a disaster. California is going to be a disaster. It too was passed by the legislature.
Now, disaster in the sense California, I don't think is Trump not relying on it for the electoral college, right? So it doesn't really matter in that sense.
It'll only matter popular vote. It'll matter with some House races. So California, New York, and Illinois all have contested House races. And for people making bets on turnout, making bets on popular vote, it will have an influence there. I think you're going to see some interesting turnout in those states.
Is there any chance on God's green earth California goes Republican, or is it a write-off, for the rest of political history? Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Nevada.
That's the chance.
Okay.
0.
No, how many electoral college votes is Nevada?
7. 7.
So it's not that also, as big of a mess as it is, it's the exposure is sort of minimal in the sense that it's not a winner. It's not a make or break state for electoral college.
Correct. Exactly. I mean, what it was is Trump could have had a path without winning any Midwestern state if he added New Hampshire and Nevada, or Maine and Nevada. So it was one of those outside paths. His campaign is spending a lot of time and money here. I think it's a waste at this point. I mean, I told him that from the get-go once the law went through. But I'm still of that inclination. So it's because I don't think now upside. I do think Pennsylvania's law is going to be struck down by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court should make a decision this week, because what happened in Pennsylvania is it was entirely judicially created. And listen to what they did in Pennsylvania. Not only can your ballot come in 3, 4, 5 days, I forget whether it's 3 or 5 days after Election Day, it doesn't even have to be postmarked on Election Day. The rule is under Pennsylvania's Supreme Court, which is a democratically controlled Supreme Court, which also completely redistricted all the congressional districts before 2018 to help give Democrats a huge edge in the redistricting there. They came in and they said a ballot has to be presumed to have been postmarked prior to Election Day, even if it has no postmark or if the postmark is afterwards, unless you prove that ballot was not mailed by Election Day, which is almost impossible when the postmark is an irrelevant piece of evidence. So now all of that was judicially created. Pennsylvania Republican legislature, they didn't pass those rules. So that's why I think the U.S. Supreme Court is going to overturn it. My argument that all ballots should be by Election Day because the federal statute it says that, and that's what most of Trump's legal analysis was from his team, is likely not going to be followed because Kavanaugh didn't talk about it at all in that decision where they concurred. But because Pennsylvania is all judicially engrafted anyway, I think it's going to be reversed, and I think Pennsylvania is going to have ballots reported by Election Day. Because, by the way, I won't go into great detail here, but there's a lot of misanalysis of the early vote. A bunch of Republicans are not voting early in Pennsylvania because they think Democrats are going to steal the election. So they're waiting until Election Day because they're trying to make it as hard as possible. If they if they can't report ballots after Election Day, that strategy will benefit Republicans to wait until Election Day. And I think that's what the Supreme Court's going to rule. I think it's going to say this is a judicial, but it's a crazy thing what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did. It basically gave Philadelphia 5 more days to find ballots after Election Day.
Okay, that's fascinating. And when you say you're going to talk about it later, you mean People's Pundit Mondays at 2:00 on YouTube?
Yes. I'll get into a little bit more of their terrible early voting analysis that people are doing out there on both sides. A bunch of young Republican data nerds are out there trying to read tea leaves about early voting. They don't understand what they're doing. So there is an art form to it. It's mostly very secondary data to interpret. But what people don't realize is a whole bunch of people are voting because of how they're reading the legal environment. So in North Carolina, there's a bunch of Republicans that don't want to vote early because they think Democrats will stuff the ballot box or find voters, maybe legitimately, but a lot of them don't think of it that way. So whether you agree or disagree with Republicans' interpretation of Democratic fraud, it's indisputably influencing the election because a lot of them believe it, and it's because they've seen odd things. If you live in North Carolina or Pennsylvania, you've had multiple state or federal indictments over the past 3 years related to voter fraud, stuffing the ballot box, bogus absentee ballots, bogus mail-in ballots, ballots going missing. So this is the Supreme Court's decision will make a huge impact on what voters actually do.
Amazing. And that is in theory, it's not just supposed to, it's going to come down this week.
Yes. I think so. People thought it would actually come down this past week. It's just because we're on the eve of it, and at some point it's kind of unfair to Pennsylvania voters for them not to know when their ballot will count. Yeah. So that's why I think they'll at least by the next week. I mean, by the latest.
All right, and I'm reading this. American Sun says, please tell Robert that I spent 6 hours watching People's Pundit, and I still don't know what Robert's predictions are for Trump, the Senate, and the House. Follow Robert on Twitter as well. It's Barnes_law. You'll know, because I know what Robert thinks. And
for all the specific predictions, you got to watch the show.
But do follow him on Twitter, because I read your Twitter now like the way you explain it, like not a train of consciousness, but rather a bookmark, a diary, to see what you want to remember.
An internal curational feed of ideas that I find interesting.
You'll see, because Robert gives certain people a hard time and really pulls out the stuff that indicates what he thinks. But People's Pundit.